1:30 in the morning. Two Mark 8 SEAL delivery vehicles glided through the black depths of the Persian Gulf toward the Iranian coast. This was no longer a simulation, and the mission clock was already counting down from 60 minutes. If the team failed to reach the inner basin before the harbor defense cycle reset, they would be trapped inside a kill zone with no way out. The water was thick with the scent of salt and heavy fuel oil. Green light from the control panels reflected off the glass masks of the 8 divers inside. The hulls of the submersibles vibrated with the low, steady pulse of their electric motors. Inside the lead craft, the navigator gripped the control stick. His eyes were fixed on the green glow of the navigation screen. The screen showed the jagged coastline and the narrow opening of the harbor. Outside the thick acrylic windows, the world was a void of black and gray. The divers were breathing a specialized gas mix from their closed-circuit rigs. There were no bubbles to give them away. There was no sound to betray their position. There was only the mission. The team consisted of 8 members of the United States Navy SEALs. They were specialists in underwater sabotage and unconventional warfare. Each man carried a load of demolition charges and specialized tools. The charges were designed to punch through the thick steel of a submarine hull. The primary target was 3 Kilo-class submarines sitting at the pier. These vessels were the primary threat to the carrier strike group, operating in the Strait of Hormuz. The pressure of the water increased as they dove to 10 meters. The pressure pushed against their chests and their ears. The temperature of the water dropped 3 degrees in an instant. The cold seeped through their thick wetsuits and chilled their bones. They ignored the discomfort. They focused on the timeline. 55 minutes remained. Above them, the surface was crowded with the silhouettes of civilian ships. Large tankers and cargo vessels sat at anchor. They were waiting for their turn to load at the terminal. The massive propellers of a container ship churned the water 500 meters to their left. The sound was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the submersibles. It was a dangerous environment. A single collision with a fishing net or a submerged cable would be fatal. The navigator adjusted his course by 2 degrees to stay clear of the shipping lane. They approached the first security boom. The Iranians had placed a heavy steel net across the entrance to the inner harbor. The net was designed to catch small boats and divers. It was fitted with electronic sensors. Any contact would alert the harbor guard immediately. The team had a plan for the net. They slowed the vehicles to a speed of 1 knot. The lead vehicle stopped 5 meters from the steel mesh. 2 divers exited the craft into the open water. They moved with slow, deliberate motions to avoid creating any turbulence. Their hands found the cold metal of the net. They used a specialized hydraulic cutter to create an opening. The tool hissed as it bit through the thick wire. The sound seemed loud in the absolute silence of the underwater world. They worked quickly. Their movements were practiced through hundreds of hours of training in the dark. The opening was finished in 3 minutes. The divers signaled with a light tap on the hull of the vehicle. The submersibles moved through the gap one at a time. They were now inside the inner perimeter. The security was much tighter here. Active sonar from an Iranian patrol boat swept the area. The sound was a sharp, high-pitched ping that echoed through the water. The men held their breath and remained still. The ping hit the hull of the craft and bounced back. The signal was small. The Iranian operator might mistake it for a large fish or a patch of debris. The submersibles hugged the bottom of the harbor. They moved through the silt and the trash that covered the seabed. Visibility was down to 2 meters. The navigator relied entirely on his instruments to find the way. The clock continued its relentless countdown. 48 minutes. The shadows of the concrete piers appeared ahead of them. They were massive structures that reached down into the dark water. The team moved toward pier number 4. That was where the first submarine was docked. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase. The divers checked their gear one last time. They checked the seals on their masks. They checked the readiness of their weapons. The fight was about to begin. 45 minutes remained on the mission clock. The 2 submersibles hovered inches above the silty harbor floor of Bandar Abbas. Somewhere directly above, a patrol boat's engine cut out. It was replaced by the rhythmic splashing of a manual search. The divers inside the craft froze. They wondered if their silhouette against the muddy bottom had been spotted. The water tasted of iron and stagnant sewage. The pressure of the deep basin pressed against their lungs like a heavy weight. The lead navigator watched the green screen. A single white dot moved slowly across the display. It was an Iranian harbor patrol craft. It was sitting dead in the water, drifting with the tide. The Iranians were listening. They were using passive sonar to search for the hum of an electric motor. The SEALs knew the game. They switched their power to the lowest possible setting. The submersibles crawled forward at the speed of a walking man. The water was a soup of harbor trash and diesel. Visibility dropped to less than 1 meter. The lead diver reached out his hand. He touched the cold, slimy surface of a concrete piling. It was covered in sharp barnacles and thick moss. These pilings were the bones of the pier. They were massive pillars that reached into the blackness above. One mistake would tear a dry suit. A tear in this oily water meant an immediate risk of infection and a slow, cold death. The team moved in a staggered line. The second submersible followed, the wake of the first. They were navigating a forest of concrete and steel. Above them, the surface of the water flickered. With the sweep of a powerful searchlight, the light cut through the oily film on the surface. It sent long, shimmering fingers of white light down into the depths. The divers pressed themselves against the pilings. They waited for the light to pass. The sound of the patrol boat's engine returned. It was a sudden, roaring cough that vibrated through the water. The propeller began to churn. The sound was like a giant grinding its teeth. The pressure waves from the propeller wash hit the submersibles. The small craft rocked in the turbulence. The divers gripped their seats. They fought to maintain their depth. They could not afford to float to the surface. The patrol boat moved away. Its sound faded into a low thrum. The lead navigator checked his heading. They were 300 meters from the inner basin. This was the most heavily guarded area of the port. The Iranians had installed underwater cameras and motion sensors on the seafloor. The SEALs had studied the layout for months. They knew the blind spots. They steered the submersibles into a narrow drainage pipe. The pipe was 4 meters wide. It was filled with the runoff from the city. The water here was thick and black. It smelled of chemicals and waste. It was a disgusting environment, but it was invisible to sonar. The pipe led them directly under the main pier. They emerged from the pipe 5 minutes later. They were now inside the inner basin. The water was calmer here. The massive shapes of ships loomed in the darkness. These were the primary targets. The Kilo-class submarines. They looked like giant black whales resting on the surface. Each one was 70 meters long. To the United States Navy. The first submarine was designated Target Alpha. It sat low in the water. Its black hull was slick. With moisture, the SEALs could hear the sound of a generator running inside the vessel. It was a steady, mechanical heartbeat. There were guards on the deck above. The divers could see the glow of cigarettes against the dark sky. The guards were relaxed. They did not expect an attack from below. The submersibles came to a halt 20 meters from the submarine. The divers began their final checks. They pulled their demolition charges from the storage lockers. These were Mark 0 Limpet mines. They were designed to stick to the hull with powerful magnets. Each mine contained 20 kilograms of high explosives. It was enough to rupture the pressure hull and send the submarine to the bottom. The lead diver signaled the team. He used a series of hand signals in the dim green light. The team split into 2 groups. 4 men would handle Target Alpha. The other 4 would move toward Target Bravo and Target Charlie. They had 38 minutes left. The margin for error was gone. Every movement had to be perfect. The water around them was silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of their breathing rigs. The divers slid out of the submersibles. They swam toward the black hull of the first submarine. They moved with the grace of predators. Their fins kicked slowly. They stayed in the deepest shadows. The mission was entering its most critical phase. The first charge was about to be set. 35 minutes remained on the mission clock. The lead diver reached out and touched the hull of Target Alpha. It was a massive wall of cold, black steel. The surface was slick with algae and sea growth. He could feel the vibration of the submarine's internal pumps through his gloves. It was a low, mechanical growl that echoed in his chest. The water tasted of salt and old grease. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim green glow of his wrist-mounted compass. The team moved in pairs. They worked with the silent precision of ghosts. Each man carried 2 Mark 0 Limpet mines. These mines were heavy, awkward cylinders filled with high explosives. The lead diver pulled the first mine from his harness. He pressed it against the steel hull. The powerful magnets engaged with a dull metallic clink. The sound felt like a gunshot in the underwater silence. The diver froze. He looked up toward the surface. A faint yellow glow from the pier lights filtered through the water. He could see the dark silhouette of the submarine sail against the night sky. No alarm sounded. No guards looked over the rail. The team continued their work. They placed the charges along the keel of the submarine. This was the most vulnerable part of the vessel. An explosion here would break the back of the ship. It would cause an immediate and catastrophic flood. They set the timers for 25 minutes. The water was dead still. The smell of the breathing gas in their masks was dry and metallic. Their hands were numb from the cold water. They ignored the pain. They moved to the second set of targets. Target Bravo and Target Charlie were moored 50 meters away. The divers kicked their fins in a slow, steady rhythm. They stayed 3 meters below the surface. They were invisible to anyone watching from the pier. Suddenly, a bright light cut through the water. A powerful searchlight from the pier was sweeping the basin. The beam moved slowly. It illuminated the clouds of silt and debris in the water. The seals pressed themselves tight against the submarine's hull. They were hidden in the deep shadow of the curve. The light passed over them. It stayed on the water's surface for 5 seconds, then moved on. The lead diver signaled to move. They pushed off from Target Alpha and kicked toward the next pier. Target Bravo loomed ahead. It was another Kilo-class submarine, identical to the first. The second team was already in position. They were moving toward the stern. They needed to plant charges near the propeller and the rudder. This would ensure the ship could not be towed or repaired after the strike. The clock ticked down to 30 minutes. The tension was rising. Every second spent in the basin increased the chance of detection. The harbor was a trap. The only way out was through the same narrow gap in the security net. One of the divers felt a sudden change in the water pressure. A small harbor craft was approaching the pier. Its engine was a high-pitched whine. The sound grew louder and louder. The boat was passing directly over their heads. The wash from its propeller pushed the divers down toward the bottom. They gripped the pier pilings to stay steady. The boat slowed down and stopped at a maintenance ladder. They could hear voices calling out in Farsi from the deck above. A heavy object hit the water with a splash. It was a mooring line. The SEALs held their breath. They were less than 10 meters from the Iranian sailors. The boat's engine cut off. Silence returned to the harbor. The divers waited for 1 full minute. They did not move a muscle. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. The cold water seeped into their suits, but they remained as still as stones. Finally, the lead diver gave the signal. They had 28 minutes left. They had 2 more submarines to kill. The work on Target Bravo was faster. The divers had found their rhythm. They attached 4 mines in under 3 minutes. They moved with mechanical efficiency. They were no longer men. They were a part of the darkness. They were a part of the machine. The final target, Target Charlie, was positioned at the end of the pier. It was the furthest point from the exit. As they reached the final submarine, the lead diver saw something that made him stop. 2 Iranian divers were in the water near the bow. They were conducting a routine hull inspection with handheld torches. The beams of their lights danced across the steel. The SEALs were exposed. They were caught between the submarine and the open water. There was no time to retreat. The mission was about to change. 25 minutes remained on the mission clock. The Iranian divers were 50 feet away, their underwater torches cutting through the black harbor water like surgical beams. The lead SEAL pressed his back into the thick, freezing mud of the harbor floor. The water here was a graveyard of discarded cable and rusted metal. He could feel the vibration of the enemy's swim fins through the silt. The sound was a rhythmic, wet slapping that grew louder with every second. The team stayed absolutely still. Their closed-circuit breathing rigs made no bubbles, but the mechanical hiss of the regulators felt like a roar in the silence. The taste of the recycled air was stale and carried a hint of copper. Above them, the massive black belly of Target Charlie blocked out what little light filtered down from the surface. The submarine was a silent monster of steel, 80 meters of lethal machinery resting in the oily dark. The Iranian divers moved slowly along the port side of the hull. They were checking the intake grates for debris. One of the beams swept across a concrete piling just inches from a seal's head. The light illuminated the green moss and the jagged barnacles on the stone. The seal did not blink. He gripped his suppressed weapon, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. If they were spotted, the mission would turn into a bloodbath in seconds. The torch beams flickered and then began to move toward the bow. The Iranians were moving away. The lead seal waited for the count of 10, then signaled his partner. They had to move now. They kicked their fins in a slow, powerful stroke that pushed them up toward the keel of the submarine. They reached the curved steel of the hull. The lead diver pulled the final 2 Mark 0 Limpet mines from his harness. These were the heaviest charges they carried. Each one was a black cylinder packed with 20 kilograms of plastic explosive. He reached up and pressed the first mine against the steel. The magnets engaged with a soft thud. He could feel the cold of the hull through his gloves. The second diver moved toward the stern. He needed to place his charges near the drive shaft. He navigated the forest of intake pipes and cooling vents. The smell of diesel fuel was stronger here, a thick chemical bite that seeped through the seals of his mask. He found the target area. He worked with the speed of a man who had performed this action 1,000 times in the dark. The magnets clicked into place. He reached for the mechanical timer on the side of the mine. He turned the dial until it clicked at 15 minutes. All the charges across all 3 submarines were now synchronized. In 15 minutes, the harbor would belong to the fire. The Iranian divers were returning. They had finished their sweep of the bow and were swimming back toward the maintenance ladder. The seals were trapped between the hull and the incoming swimmers. There was no room to hide. The lead diver looked at his partner. He pointed toward a narrow gap between the submarine's rudder and the concrete pier. They slid into the gap, pulling their bodies tight against the cold stone. The Iranian divers passed 5 feet above them. The seals could see the yellow tanks on their backs and the black rubber of their masks. One of the Iranians stopped. He pointed his light down toward the mud. The beam danced across the spot where the seals had been lying moments before. A cloud of disturbed silt hung in the water like a ghost. The Iranian diver hovered for 3 seconds. He seemed to be squinting through the dark water. The lead seal held his breath, his heart hammering against the inside of his ribs. The pressure of the water felt like a physical hand squeezing his chest. Then, the Iranian diver signaled to his partner and continued toward the ladder. They had seen nothing. The seals waited until the sound of the Iranians climbing the ladder reached them through the water. It was a series of metallic clangs that echoed through the basin. The team moved instantly. They kicked away from Target Charlie and headed back toward the drainage pipe. 20 minutes left. They were halfway to the extraction point. The water around them began to churn. Above the surface, something had changed. The low thrum of the harbor was replaced by the sudden, frantic shouting of men on the pier. A siren began to wail, a long, mournful cry that tore through the night air. The seals didn't wait to find out what had gone wrong. They increased their pace, their fins driving them through the dark water at maximum speed. They reached the mouth of the drainage pipe and slid inside the black tunnel. Behind them, the harbor was waking up. The hunt had begun. 15 minutes remained on the mission clock. The siren continued its rhythmic, soul-crushing scream across the concrete expanse of Bandar Abbas. The seals emerged from the black mouth of the drainage pipe. They were back in the inner basin, but the water was no longer a silent sanctuary. High-intensity searchlights from the pier towers were sweeping the surface in frantic, overlapping patterns. The white beams cut through the oily mist, reflecting off the dark water like silver blades. The air above the surface was thick, with the smell of scorched diesel and the sharp ozone tang of the alarm systems. The team stayed low, their heads barely, breaking the surface near the shadow of a rusted barge. They were 50 meters from the SDV submersibles. Between them and their exit sat an Iranian security patrol on the pier. A group of 6 guards in olive drab uniforms were running toward the maintenance ladder, clutching AK-47 rifles. A light armored vehicle, a BTR-60, was rumbling down the pier, its heavy tires thumping against the concrete. The turret was already traversing, searching for a target. The team leader knew they couldn't swim past the pier without being shredded by heavy machine gun fire. He signaled for the heavy weapons specialist they needed to clear the way. The specialist reached into his waterproof gear bag and pulled out an AT-4 light anti-armor weapon. He broke the surface slowly, the water shedding off the olive drab tube. He braced his shoulder against the cold concrete of the barge. The trigger was squeezed. The rocket shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the faces of the SEALs standing nearest, a searing wave of chemical energy. The smoke rose in a dense white column that blotted out the pier for 3 full seconds. The rocket streaked across the 50-meter gap, a finger of white light splitting the darkness. The warhead punched clean through the side armor of the BTR-60, detonating the fuel cell stored inside. The vehicle's turret lifted straight off the hull 6 tons of steel, rising 4 meters before it fell back and crushed 2 guards running from the fire. The hull itself split along the weld seams. Black smoke boiled out of every opening. A fireball erupted that bleached the sky white, the heat melting the rubber tires into a black, sticky sludge in seconds. The surviving guards erupted in panic. They did not stand still. They wrenched their bodies away from the inferno, throwing themselves over the side of the pier or diving behind concrete barriers. One man's uniform was caught in the blast, and he became a living torch, screaming as he stumbled into the dark water. The disciplined formation was gone, replaced by a chaotic scramble for survival. The return fire was wild and uncoordinated, bullets stitching harmless lines into the water 30 meters away from the SEALs. Black smoke rose from the wreckage still settling onto the pier. The burning pieces were still red hot when the radio channels of the Iranian port security went silent for exactly 3 seconds, then erupted in overlapping voices, each one louder than the last. The diversion was complete. The pier was a graveyard of twisted metal and thick, acrid smoke. The team leader pointed toward the submersibles. They had to move before the secondary security teams arrived. They dove back into the oily water. The heat from the explosion was still radiating off the surface, warming the water by several degrees. The taste of the water was now foul, tainted by the chemical fire and the burnt rubber of the armored vehicle. They kicked their fins with everything they had. They reached the SDVs in less than a minute. The submersibles were still hovering where they had left them, their green lights a welcome sight in the gloom. The divers slid back into their seats. The navigator gripped the controls, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The clock ticked down to 12 minutes. The first of the Kilo-class submarines, Target Alpha, was sitting 300 meters behind them. The charges were live. The timers were counting down the final seconds of the submarine's life. The charges harbor was now a hornet's nest. More searchlights were clicking on. Patrol boats were screaming toward the inner basin from the outer harbor. The navigator pushed the throttles forward. The electric motors hummed to life, vibrating through the hull of the craft. They began to descend, leaving the light and the fire behind. They were heading for the gap in the security net. They had to be through that gap before the first explosion occurred. If the blast wave caught them in the open water, the pressure would crush the submersibles like tin cans. The darkness swallowed them again. The only sound was the hiss of their breathing and the low whine of the motors. They were moving at maximum speed, pushing the small craft to their limits. The mission was nearly over, but the most dangerous part of the escape was just beginning. The harbor was about to erupt. 10 minutes to extraction. The first Kilo-class submarine, Target Alpha, was already a dead ship walking. Inside the lead Mark 8 sealed delivery vehicle, the navigator watched the mission clock bleed down to the final seconds. The SDVs were pushing through the inner harbor at 6 knots, their electric motors whining under the strain of the maximum power setting. The water was a chaotic swirl of silt and bioluminescence. The smell of recycled oxygen in the divers' masks was dry and tasted of cold copper. The team was less than 800 meters from the harbor entrance net. Behind them, the pier was a silhouette of orange fire and black smoke from the destroyed armored vehicle. The Iranian port security was now fully awake. Dozens of high-intensity searchlights crisscrossed the water. The beams were so powerful, they penetrated 5 meters into the depths, illuminating the SDVs like ghosts in the dark. The clock hit 0. The 4 Mark 0 Limpet mines attached to the keel of Target Alpha detonated in perfect sequence. The trigger was a silent electronic pulse that transformed 20 kilograms of stable plastic explosive into a searing ball of white-hot gas. The primary charge punched through the outer hull with a force of 10,000 pounds per square inch. The shockwave was a physical hammer that shattered the concrete pier pilings 50 meters away. A column of white water and pulverized steel erupted 300 feet into the night sky. The pressure hull of the Kilo-class submarine did not just leak, it disintegrated. The keel snapped like a dry twig under the immense pressure of the blast. Seawater, driven by the weight of the harbor, roared into the engine room at a speed of 60 miles per hour. The internal bulkheads buckled and groaned. The sound was a screeching metal scream that could be heard for miles. Inside the vessel, the massive batteries short-circuited, sending arcs of blue electricity through the flooding compartments before the darkness took over. The Iranian crew on the deck never had a chance to react. The sudden list to port threw men across the steel plating and into the freezing, oily water. Those trapped below were silenced in seconds by the wall of water. On the pier, guards watched in frozen horror as $70 million of naval technology began to slide beneath the surface. The stern rose high into the air, the massive propeller spinning uselessly in the smoke-filled sky before the entire vessel slipped into the mud of the harbor floor. A massive bubble of trapped air and diesel fuel breached the surface with a thunderous belch. The water where Target Alpha had been was now a churning whirlpool of black oil and debris. The harbor fell into a dead silence for 3 seconds, the sound of the siren drowned out by the weight of the destruction. Then, the secondary explosions began as the internal oxygen canisters cooked off. The shockwave hit the escaping SEAL delivery vehicles like a physical blow. The lead craft was slammed downward toward the seabed. The navigator fought the controls, his knuckles white against the stick. The pressure wave compressed the air inside the divers' lungs. It felt like a heavy weight was sitting on their chests. The water around them turned into a cloud of black silt, reducing visibility to 0. The navigator relied on his inertial navigation system. He kept the nose of the craft pointed toward the gap in the net. Behind them, 2 more explosions were coming. Targets Bravo and Charlie were only 60 seconds away from the same fate. The Iranian patrol boats were now converging on the basin. They were dropping depth charges blindly into the water. The dull thuds of the depth charges echoed through the holes of the SDVs. Each one was a vibration that rattled the divers' teeth. The water was thick with the smell of burnt propellant and the iron tang of the sea. The SEALs were moving through a graveyard of their own making. They reached the security net. The gap they had cut earlier was still there, a dark doorway in the steel mesh. The lead SDV slipped through. The second craft followed seconds later. They were out of the inner basin. But the mission was not over. The 3-mile run to the extraction point was across open water. The Iranian Navy was already launching fast boats from the nearby naval base. The clock ticked toward the next detonation. The water behind them began to glow with an eerie, underwater light. The second submarine was about to die. The team pushed their engines even harder. They were racing the fire and the shockwave. 7 minutes remained on the mission clock. The 2 Mark 8 SEAL delivery vehicles were 200 meters clear of the harbor net, when the world behind them turned into a volcano of white light and pulverized steel. Target Bravo and Target Charlie detonated within 3 seconds of each other. The dual explosions were so powerful, they briefly pushed the water level of the inner basin down by a full meter, before the sea rushed back in to fill the void. Inside the lead submersible, the navigator felt the shock wave slam into the hull like a high-speed train. The pressure wave compressed the air inside the craft, making the diver's ears pop painfully. The sound was a low, guttural roar that traveled through the water faster than a bullet. The green navigation screen flickered and died for 2 seconds before the backup power kicked in. The water around them turned into a swirling soup of black mud and shredded insulation from the destroyed submarines. The divers gripped the handles of their seats as the submersibles were tossed like toys in the turbulence. The heat from the explosions, even at this distance, radiated through the water, warming the hulls of the small craft. The smell of the breathing gas in their masks was dry and metallic, tinged with the sudden spike of adrenaline. They did not look back. They pushed the electric motors to their absolute breaking point, the whine of the turbines reaching a high-pitched scream. They reached the designated surfacing point 3 miles off the coast. The water here was deeper and colder, the surface chopped into 2-meter swells by a rising wind. The lead navigator pulled back on the control stick. The SDV angled its nose upward. The green glow of the harbor lights faded as they rose through the water column. The pressure on their chests eased as they neared the surface. The hull broke the water with a splash. The divers immediately threw back the acrylic canopies. The night air was a shock to their systems, cold, wet, and thick with the heavy scent of burning oil and cordite drifting from the harbor. 3 columns of black smoke rose into the sky behind them, illuminated from below by the orange glow of the burning port. "Rendezvous in 60 seconds," the team leader shouted over the sound of the wind. He pulled a folding stock M4 carbine from its waterproof scabbard and scanned the horizon with his night vision goggles. The world turned into a grainy green landscape of white caps and shadows. 2 miles to the east, the silhouettes of 3 Iranian fast boats appeared. They were Bagamar patrol craft, their twin outboard engines screaming at 5,000 revolutions per minute. The spray from their bows looked like wings of white glass in the moonlight. They were closing the gap at 40 knots, the crews already manning their 12.7mm heavy machine guns. The SEALs were sitting ducks in the slow, low-profile submersibles. They needed the extraction craft now. Suddenly, the roar of much larger engines drowned out the Iranian patrol boats. Out of the darkness to the south, 2 Mark V special operations craft tore through the waves at 50 knots. These were 80-foot aluminum monsters, each powered by twin 5 to 1,000 horsepower jet drives. They didn't just move through the water, they flew over it. The spray from their hulls created a wall of mist 10 meters high. The lead Mark V veered toward the Iranian formation, its bow dipping as it cut through a swell. The heavy weapons specialist on the deck gripped the handles of the GAU-17 minigun. The trigger was squeezed. The weapon shrieked as it spun to life, a 6-barreled blur that spat 3,000 rounds per minute. A solid line of tracer fire, looking like a laser of continuous red light, reached out across the water. The sound was not a sequence of shots, but a continuous, mechanical growl that vibrated through the air and the water alike. The smell of burnt gunpowder and hot oil instantly blotted out the salt spray. The lead Iranian fast boat did not just take hits, it disintegrated. The line of 76mm rounds punched through the fiberglass hull and into the fuel tanks. The vessel erupted instantly into a fireball that rose 20 meters into the air. The fragments of the hull were sent flying in every direction, skipping across the surface like stones. The crew was gone before they could even reach for their triggers. The second Iranian boat swerved hard to port to avoid the wreckage. The pilot kicked the rudder so hard, the boat nearly capsized. The SEALs on the SDVs did not wait. They abandoned the submersibles and swam toward the side of the second Mark V, which had slowed down just enough for them to grab the extraction ladders. The water was a chaotic mess of foam, fire, and tracers. The air was filled with the screams of engines and the thunder of the miniguns. The SEALs hauled themselves onto the deck, their heavy gear clattering against the metal plates. "All divers up!" the team leader yelled into his radio. The Mark V captain didn't wait for a reply. He slammed the throttles forward. The jet drives roared, and the boat lurched forward, pinning the SEALs against the deck. They were moving at 60 miles per hour, heading for the safety of the open sea. Behind them, the Iranian harbor was a hellscape of fire and smoke. The 3 Kilo-class submarines were at the bottom of the basin. The mission was a success. 1:55 in the morning. The 2 Mark V Special Operations craft tore across the dark expanse of the Persian Gulf, heading southwest toward international waters. The engines were screaming at maximum power, pushing the 80-foot aluminum hulls to a speed of 55 knots. Every time the lead boat hit a 2-meter swell, the entire frame shuddered with a bone-jarring thud that sent plumes of white spray 10 meters into the air. The SEALs were strapped into their shock-absorbing seats, their hands white-knuckled as they gripped the safety rails. The air was a freezing blast of salt and spray, flavored by the hot, oily breath of the twin jet drives. Behind them, the Iranian coast was a jagged black line illuminated by the orange glow of the burning harbor. The 3 Kilo-class submarines were gone, but the Hornet's nest was fully stirred. Radar technicians on the Mark V boats watched the tactical displays with grim intensity. Multiple high-speed contacts were emerging from the coastal mist. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had launched every available asset to intercept the raiders. "Contact! Bearing 080, the radar operator shouted over the roar of the wind. 3 fast boats, closing at 45 knots, and we have a low-flying air contact. Looks like a helicopter, 5 miles out and coming fast." The team leader looked back. Through his night vision goggles, he could see the faint flickering of the Iranian searchlights. Then, a new sound joined the mechanical scream of the engines. It was the rhythmic, heavy thumping of rotor blades. An Iranian AH-1 Super Cobra attack helicopter emerged from the darkness, staying low to the water to avoid radar detection. Its nose-mounted 3-barrel 20mm cannon was already traversing, searching for the heat signatures of the American jet drives. "Weapons free," the boat captain yelled. "Engage the air contact." The heavy weapons specialist on the aft deck of the lead, Mark V, didn't hesitate. He swung the GAU-17 minigun toward the sky. The weapon's electric motor whined as the 6 barrels began to spin. The trigger was squeezed. A solid stream of 7.62mm rounds erupted from the barrels, a continuous red laser of tracer fire that sliced through the night air. The sound was a terrifying, mechanical saw blade roar that drowned out the engines and the wind. The smell of burnt powder and hot metal filled the air instantly, a sharp chemical bite that stung the eyes. The tracers reached out and stitched a line of fire across the sky, missing the helicopter's cockpit by less than 3 meters. The Iranian pilot reacted instantly. He flared the helicopter, pulling the nose up to bleed off speed, and loosed a pair of unguided rockets. The rockets shrieked off the stub wings, leaving 2 long fingers of white exhaust trailing behind them. They streaked across the water, missing the stern of the Mark V by less than 20 meters. They hit the surface of the Gulf and detonated with twin geysers of white water that rose 30 feet into the air. The shock wave of the underwater explosions rocked the boat, sending a wall of spray over the SEALs on the deck. "Impact on the lead fast boat," the starboard gunner yelled. He was manning an M240 Bravo machine gun, his tracers skipping across the waves toward the pursuing Boghammer craft. One of the 7.62mm rounds found the Iranian boat's exposed outboard engine. A bright flash of blue and orange light erupted. From the stern of the fast boat, the engine disintegrated in a spray of sparks and metal fragments. The boat pitched violently to the left, its bow digging into a swell at 40 knots. The hull flipped end over end, throwing the crew into the dark water and shattering into 1,000 pieces of fiberglass and debris. The helicopter was coming back for a second pass. The pilot was more cautious now. Staying further back and using his superior range, he prepared to fire a guided missile. The SEALs knew they couldn't win. A long-distance duel with an attack helicopter. "Brake right, now," the captain commanded. The Mark V leaned into a violent turn, the jet drives carving a massive arc of foam into the sea. The SEALs were nearly thrown from their seats by the centrifugal force. As the boat leveled out, the team leader grabbed a FIM-92 Stinger missile tube from the ready rack. He braced himself against the railing, his boots sliding on the wet aluminum deck. He peered through the optical sight, waiting for the high-pitched growl of the infrared seeker. The seeker found the heat of the helicopter's engine. The tone in his headset changed from a low buzz to a steady, piercing hum. He pulled the trigger. The missile's launch motor fired, popping the projectile out of the tube before the flight motor ignited with a deafening roar. The Stinger streaked into the dark, a small, brilliant point of white light chasing the Iranian Cobra. The helicopter pilot saw the launch and dumped a handful of magnesium flares. The sky filled with brilliant white sparks that burned at 3,000 degrees. But the Stinger was a modern variant, programmed to ignore the decoys. It ignored the flares and stayed locked on the primary heat source. The missile punched straight into the helicopter's exhaust port. The detonation was a sharp, brilliant flash that severed the tail rotor and blew the engine housing apart. The AH-1 Super Cobra spun wildly for 3 seconds, a chaotic blur of fire and falling metal before it slammed into the Persian Gulf. A massive fireball erupted on the surface, illuminating the wreckage for a fleeting moment, before the black water swallowed it whole. Silence, relatively speaking, returned to the deck as the minigun stopped spinning. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and the salt of the sea. The remaining Iranian fast boats, seeing their air support destroyed, broke off their pursuit and turned back toward the coast. "Status," the team leader shouted. "We're clear for now," the captain replied, his voice raspy from the adrenaline. "But we're still 10 miles from the extraction ship. Keep those eyes open. They'll be sending the fixed-wing stuff next." The two boats continued their high-speed run, two white scars on a black sea. Behind them, the horizon was still burning. The mission was 80% complete, but the most dangerous 10 miles of the Persian Gulf still lay ahead of them. 2 in the morning. The dark waters of the Persian Gulf. The two Mark V boats were running at 55 knots, their hulls screaming as they slammed into the rising swells. 10 miles of open water stood between the SEALs and the safety of the carrier strike group, but the Iranian Navy was not finished yet. The air was a freezing blur of salt spray and the hot, sulfurous smell of the jet exhaust. Above them, the stars were blotted out by thick, oily smoke drifting from the burning port of Bandar Abbas. The radar operator on the lead boat leaned into his screen, his face illuminated by a ghostly green light. Multiple contacts, bearing 190. They're coming out from behind the Keshem Island cliffs. 1 large signature, 2 small. The big one is a Kaman-class missile boat. Speed is 35 knots and closing. The team leader wiped a layer of salt from his goggles. He could feel the vibration of the boat's deck through the soles of his boots. It was a rhythmic, violent shaking that traveled up his spine. The taste of salt was heavy on his tongue, mixed with the iron tang of adrenaline. They were exhausted, their bodies bruised from the high-speed transit, but the mission wasn't over. Bridge. "This is tactical," the team leader shouted over the roar of the wind. "We need air support now. That missile boat has a longer reach than our miniguns." "Copy that, tactical. Guardian flight is 2 minutes out. Hold tight." The Iranian missile boat was 5 miles away when the first warning receiver began to chirp. It was a steady, high-pitched electronic pulse. The Kaman-class boat had locked its fire control radar onto the Mark V hulls. Seconds later, a brilliant flash of orange erupted from the deck of the Iranian vessel. A C-802 anti-ship missile tore into the night sky. It dropped to a height of only 5 meters above the water, its rocket motor carving a white scar through the darkness. The missile was traveling at nearly the speed of sound. It was a sea-skimming killer, designed to ignore the clutter of the waves and find the largest metal signature in its path. "Missile away! Missile away!" the captain yelled. "Deploy decoys! All hands, brace for impact!" The Mark V's chaff launchers fired. With a series of muffled pops, hundreds of thousands of tiny strips of aluminum foil were blasted into the air, creating a shimmering cloud that looked like a solid wall to the missile's radar seeker. The boat captain kicked the rudder hard to port, the jet drives roaring as they fought to change the momentum of the 80-ton vessel. The boat leaned so far over that the starboard railing dipped into the water, sending a massive wall of spray over the seals. The C-802 missile screamed past the stern of the boat, missing the engine housing by less than 10 meters. The heat from its exhaust was a physical punch that scorched the paint on the hull. The missile slammed into the water 100 meters away, detonating with a massive, muffled roar. A pillar of white water and black mud rose 50 feet into the air, raining down on the seals like a freezing storm. "Look up!" one of the gunners shouted. Two FA-18 Super Hornet fighters, designated Guardian Flight, roared over the Mark V boats at 500 feet. The sound was a deafening, chest-compressing thunder that shook the very air. The pilots were flying in full afterburner, two twin tails of blue fire trailing behind them. They had come from the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, and they were hungry for a target. The lead FA-18 dipped, its wing, banking hard toward the Iranian missile boat. The pilot selected a GBU-12 Paveway laser-guided bomb. The trigger was squeezed. The 500-pound bomb dropped from the wing station, its guidance fins snapping open as it caught the laser spot on the Iranian deck. The bomb streaked through the night, a silent shadow falling from the sky. The warhead punched clean through the bridge of the Kaman-class boat, detonating in the heart of the engine room. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The Iranian vessel didn't just sink, it was blown apart from the inside out. The hull split into 3 distinct pieces, each one engulfed in a massive fireball that rose 50 meters into the air. The secondary explosions of the remaining missiles on the deck created a series of brilliant white flashes that illuminated the sea for miles. The 2 smaller Iranian patrol boats saw the destruction and immediately turned tail, fleeing back toward the safety of the coastal cliffs. They knew they could not compete with American air power. The FA-18 fighters circled once, their pilots flashing their lights in a silent salute to the SEALs below, before climbing back into the darkness. "Extraction point in 5 miles, the captain announced. "The USS Mason is on station. We're almost home, boys." The SEALs slumped back into their seats. 10 minutes to extraction. The first Kilo-class submarine, Target Alpha, was already a dead ship walking. Inside the lead Mark 8 SEAL delivery vehicle, the navigator watched the mission clock bleed down to the final seconds. The SDVs were pushing through the inner harbor at 6 knots, their electric motors whining under the strain of the maximum power setting. The water was a chaotic swirl of silt and bioluminescence. The smell of recycled oxygen in the divers' masks was dry and tasted of cold copper. The team was less than 800 meters from the harbor entrance net. Behind them, the pier was a silhouette of orange fire and black smoke from the destroyed armored vehicle. The Iranian port security was now fully awake. Dozens of high-intensity searchlights crisscrossed the water. The beams were so powerful, they penetrated 5 meters into the depths, illuminating the SDVs like ghosts in the dark. The clock hit 0. The 4 Mark 0 Limpet mines attached to the keel of Target Alpha detonated in perfect sequence. The trigger was a silent electronic pulse that transformed 20 kilograms of stable plastic explosive into a searing ball of white-hot gas. The primary charge punched through the outer hull with a force of 10,000 pounds per square inch. The shockwave was a physical hammer that shattered the concrete pier pilings 50 meters away. A column of white water and pulverized steel erupted 300 feet into the night sky. The pressure hull of the Kilo-class submarine did not just leak, it disintegrated. The keel snapped like a dry twig under the immense pressure of the blast. Seawater, driven by the weight of the harbor, roared into the engine room at a speed of 60 miles per hour. The internal bulkheads buckled and groaned. The sound was a screeching metal scream that could be heard for miles. Inside the vessel, the massive battery short-circuited, sending arcs of blue electricity through the flooding compartments before the darkness took over. The Iranian crew on the deck never had a chance to react. The sudden list to port threw men across the steel plating and into the freezing, oily water. Those trapped below were silenced in seconds by the wall of water. On the pier, Guards watched in frozen horror as $70 million of naval technology began to slide beneath the surface. The stern rose high into the air, the massive propeller spinning uselessly in the smoke-filled sky before the entire vessel slipped into the mud of the harbor floor. A massive bubble of trapped air and diesel fuel breached the surface with a thunderous belch. The water where Target Alpha had been was now a churning whirlpool of black oil and debris. The harbor fell into a dead silence for 3 seconds, the sound of the siren drowned out by the weight of the destruction. Then, the secondary explosions began as the internal oxygen canisters cooked off. The shockwave hit the escaping SEAL delivery vehicles like a physical blow. The lead craft was slammed downward toward the seabed. The navigator fought the controls, his knuckles white against the stick. The pressure wave compressed the air inside the divers' lungs. It felt like a heavy weight was sitting on their chests. The water around them turned into a cloud of black silt, reducing visibility to 0. The navigator relied on his inertial navigation system. He kept the nose of the craft pointed toward the gap in the net. Behind them, 2 more explosions were coming. Targets Bravo and Charlie were only 60 seconds away from the same fate. The Iranian patrol boats were now converging on the basin. They were dropping depth charges blindly into the water. The dull thuds of the depth charges echoed through the hulls of the SDVs. Each one was a vibration that rattled the divers' teeth. The water was thick with the smell of burnt propellant and the iron tang of the sea. The SEALs were moving through a graveyard of their own making. They reached the security net. The gap they had cut earlier was still there, a dark doorway in the steel mesh. The lead SDV slipped through. The second craft followed seconds later. They were out of the inner basin. But the mission was not over. The 3-mile run to the extraction point was across open water. The Iranian Navy was already launching fast boats from the nearby naval base. The clock ticked toward the next detonation. The water behind them began to glow with an eerie, underwater light. The second submarine was about to die. The team pushed their engines even harder. They were racing the fire and the shockwave. They were soaked to the bone, their muscles screaming with fatigue, but the tension was finally starting to bleed away. The horizon to the west was beginning to turn a pale, dusty gray. The sun would be up soon. Behind them, the coast of Iran was a wall of black smoke. The 3 Kilo-class submarines were at the bottom of the harbor. The mission was complete. 2:15 in the morning. The destroyer, USS Mason, sat low in the water 10 miles off the Iranian coast. The ship was running at modified battle stations, its AN/SPY-6 radar suites sweeping the sky for any sign of incoming anti-ship missiles or hostile aircraft. The sea was a deep, restless charcoal color, under the first faint light of the pre-dawn sky. The air carried the sharp, biting scent of salt and the distant, lingering smell of burning petroleum, drifting from the chaos at Bandar Abbas. The 2 Mark V Special Operations craft slowed as they approached the towering steel wall of the destroyer. The roar of their jet drives dropped to a low, guttural throb that vibrated through the hulls. The SEALs on the deck stood up, their legs shaking from the hours of high-speed transit and the crushing weight of their saturated gear. Their faces were smeared with black camouflage paint and crusted with dried salt. One man checked his tactical watch. The mission had taken exactly 58 minutes from the moment they entered the inner harbor to the final detonation. Mission successful, the team leader reported into his encrypted radio. 3 targets neutralized. All personnel accounted for. Requesting immediate recovery. The response from the destroyer's bridge was immediate and professional. Copy that. Tactical. We have you on visual. Welcome home. Secure all weapons and prepare for boarding. The Mark V boats pulled alongside the massive, gray hull of the USS Mason. Heavy mooring lines were thrown from the deck of the destroyer, pulling the smaller craft into the lee of the ship's shadow. A heavy steel boat deck door on the side of the hull slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing the warm, yellow light of the interior bay. The SEALs hauled themselves up the pilot ladder, their wet boots clattering against the metal rungs. As the lead diver stepped onto the deck, he felt the solid, unyielding vibration of the destroyer beneath his feet. It was the first time in 4 hours he had felt something that was not bucking or shaking. He pulled off his mask and took a deep breath of the filtered, mechanical air of the ship. It tasted of hydraulic fluid and clean linen. He leaned against the bulkhead, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain from his system, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the commanding officer watched the horizon through a pair of high-powered binoculars. The 3 pillars of black smoke on the horizon were now clearly visible, against the graying sky, leaning toward the east in the morning breeze. The Iranian harbor was still a chaotic mess of searchlights and frantic sirens, but the American strike group was already turning toward the south. The carrier USS Abraham Lincoln was 50 miles away, its flight deck already buzzing. As it prepared to launch the next combat air patrol, the cost to the Iranian Navy was catastrophic. In less than 60 minutes, the balance of power in the Persian Gulf had been reset. 3 Kilo-class submarines, the primary threat to the regional shipping lanes, were now nothing more than twisted scrap metal, resting in the harbor silt. The pressure hulls were shattered, the advanced systems destroyed by the combination of high explosives and the weight of the sea. The SEALs were led toward the medical bay for a primary assessment. They moved like ghosts through the narrow, brightly lit corridors, their black wetsuits dripping oily harbor water onto the clean deck plates. They did not talk. They did not celebrate. They were already beginning the internal process of coming down from the high of the combat engagement. Their eyes were hollow, their movements slow and deliberate, the focus of the mission still lingering in their minds. By 3 in the morning, the USS Mason was 20 miles clear of the Iranian coast. The ship increased its speed to 30 knots, its bow cutting through the 2-meter swells with effortless power. The orange glow on the horizon finally faded, swallowed by the thick morning mist. The mission was over. The silence of the open sea returned, broken only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the destroyer's engines and the sound of the wind whipping across the radar mast.